He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a heretic. He was just the man who dug graves in the frostbitten outlands of Eldenmore, where superstition cut deeper than any knife. A man named Elias Holloway lived on the edge of the village both physically and socially. He buried the dead. That was his trade. That was his curse. And everyone believed his touch could spread death like wildfire. His daughter Leora never stood a chance. By the time she was 6, she'd already learned what it meant to be shunned. In the town square, children ran from her shadow. Vendors refused to hand her bread, letting it fall to the counter like she was diseased. Even the priest avoided her eyes when she passed the chapel. They didn't see a little girl. They saw a walking omen. But here's the truth about isolation. It doesn't just hurt, it draws others like it. That's how Leora met Bram. His family was outcast too. They cleaned chamber pots, hauled refuse, scrubbed filth off cobblestone streets. Their labor was essential, but their presence was loathed. Their love wasn't some fairy tale. It was built in defiance. Two souls unwanted by the world, holding on to each other as a shield against it. When they married, there was no celebration, only silence. But they didn't need witnesses. They needed sanctuary. They made a family. First a son, Yolan, then another, Darren, and lastly, the baby, Elric. Each child was a promise they might build something better. But with every birth came a darker fear. This world would eat their children alive. They tried to stay unnoticed. Bram took whatever jobs no one else would. Leora taught the boys to keep their heads down, to move like ghosts through a village that never welcomed them. They lived in the outskirts, beyond the farmlands, in a shack barely holding together through winter storms, and still, rumors followed them. A merchant's goat died. Someone said they saw Leora pass the field the day before. A well ran dry someone. Remembered Bram stood near it once. The whispers weren't accusations yet, just tension hanging in the air like a storm, not ready to break. The Holloways were guilty of nothing but poverty and inheritance. But in a land where fear ruled over fact, that was more than enough. And though no one said it out loud, everyone knew. One wrong turn, one stroke of bad luck, and this family would become the town's perfect scapegoats. By the time Yolan was old enough to walk, the Holloways had already moved 4 times. Each village promised safety, and each village turned its back. It wasn't just superstition, it was law. In the year 1591, province of Iholm had passed the Vagrant Purity Act. It declared that families without permanent homes, land, or trade were not just undesirable, they were criminals. Every step Bram took outside to find work was a risk. Every time Leora begged for stale bread with a child on her hip, she was breaking the law. The sound of hooves on the road could mean a traitor or an arrest warrant. They lived under constant siege, not from war but from the slow crush of rules written to erase them. Then came the night that changed everything. The baby Elric was crying. Yolan and Duran hadn't eaten in 2 days. Leora had nothing left to trade, and Bram's back was failing from carrying stones for half pay. That's when he heard about a job, steady work, night work, cleaning waste pits in the city of Morphin. The kind of job no man took unless he had absolutely no other choice. But Bram didn't hesitate. When he came home with the news, Leora didn't speak at first. What could she say? It meant food, a roof. It also meant something worse, permanent visibility. People would know who they were now. They wouldn't just be strangers. They'd be the filth carriers. The Holloways already whispered about would become a living warning. The job paid in copper. Just enough. And it meant they could stay in one place. The city gave them a corner of the outer slums, a strip of mud behind the tannery where the air stank of rot and ash. Their home was a half-collapsed shack, nailed together from old timber and tarred cloth. But it didn't leak, and for the first time, they had something like stability. The price was humiliation. Bram worked in darkness, covered in rough canvas, dragging out buckets of human waste before dawn. The sounds of his labor were a symphony of shame splashes, scraping shovels, the gag of his own breath. And every morning when he returned to sleep, he passed through alleys where men spat at him and mothers pulled their children aside. The city had given them a name. Not Holloway, That was gone now. They were night drudges, scum dwellers, sewer breathers, the walking plague. The children paid for it first. At school, if they were allowed inside, they were placed in corners. No one shared food, rocks were. Thoranya alone learned to fight. Darren stopped speaking altogether. Elric clung to Leora's skirt, eyes wide and silent. Every kindness they ever received came from other ghosts like them beggars. Widows, broken men, and still they endured. They shared meals by candlelight, whispered stories to drown out the noises of rats in the walls, and held each other through winter nights that never seemed to end. In their tiny world, love still lived. But outside, a storm was building, because now they weren't just poor, they were defined, branded, easy to find, easy to blame, and soon someone would say their name for the wrong reason. It started with a man in chains. His name was Tomas Vecta, petty thief caught stealing silver from a merchant's cart in the capital city of Darathon. The gallows waited for him, but the guards offered him a bargain. Trade names for leniency. Tell them something big, something useful, and maybe, just maybe, he'd walk out alive. Tomas panicked. His crimes were petty, nothing worth mercy. So, he lied. What he gave them wasn't just a confession. It was a myth, twisted out of fear and survival. He named the Holloways, but not as beggars. Not as waste workers, as baby killers. According to Tomas, the Holloways weren't cleaning privies. They were collecting infants unbaptized, ones murdering them in secret to harvest their fat. He said they melted it into wax and poured it into black candles. Candles that, once lit, made a person invisible. Forbidden magic. A sorcery born of blood. The story spread like wildfire because it was perfect. It hit every nerve of the time. Unholy rituals, lost children, the poor dabbling in devilry. The Holloways had long been the city's walking shadows. Now, the tale gave them fangs at first. The interrogators in Darathon didn't believe it, but they didn't need to. All they needed was a target, a spectacle, in this one. It was almost too convenient. A faceless family on the edge of society, branded in filth, known but unloved. No one would defend them. No one with power, at least. The accusation did what centuries of hate could not. It made the Holloways dangerous. In taverns and prayer halls, the story mutated. They weren't just murdering infants now. They were hosting black rituals beneath the city streets, worshipping demons, spreading disease, selling their candles to thieves, to heretics, to murderers. Whispers twisted into belief. Belief twisted into rage. And all the while, the Holloways went on surviving. Bram still labored through sewage until sunrise. Leora still begged for bruised potatoes. The children still hid from stones and slurs. They had no idea their name was being weaponized in the halls of power. They had no idea that in rooms lined with gold and scripture, men were already drawing up their death warrants. Because in the heart of the capital, a man named Lord Roderick Vale, advisor to the crown and champion of the faithful order, eyed the reports with a predator's interest. He needed something loud, something grand, something terrifying to unite the fractured provinces under his iron vision of purity. The Holloways were poor, powerless, unconnected. They were perfect. The storm came just before dawn. It wasn't the wind or rain. It was steel, armor, boots, torches, the clatter of soldiers on stone. The Holloways had taken refuge in the back room of a crumbling tavern near the city's waste canal. 5 bodies curled together on a floor of straw and soot. When the door burst open, Bram barely had time to stand. They didn't come with questions. They came with chains. Leora screamed. Elric clung to her leg. Ilan lunged for the nearest guard and was slammed against the wall so hard his vision went dark. Darren tried to run, made it 2 steps, then vanished under a pile of armored limbs. The youngest screamed loudest, his voice piercing the tavern like a blade. The charges. They weren't red. Didn't have to be. Everyone in that district had heard the rumors. The Holloways were witches, baby killers, agents of unclean magic. The crowd gathered as they were dragged out, not to help but to watch. Some jeered. Others crossed themselves. No one intervened, because fear makes monsters out of ordinary people. They were taken in separate wagons each, one caged like animals. Bram was thrown into a stone cell beneath the Temple of Purity, where daylight never reached. Leora was sent to the Tower of Sisters, a place spoken of in whispers, where women emerged broken or not at all. The children were split. Yalan and Duran were sent to a holding hall, usually reserved for violent offenders. Elric, just 9 years old, was taken to the sanctuary school, an ironic name for a place that would become his cage. The interrogations began immediately. Bram was stripped, washed, shaved, not for dignity, but to check for demonic marks. The guards prodded every scar, every blemish, every birthmark. They recorded them like scripture. Then came the questions. Not questions, really accusations spoken through clenched teeth. And when Bram denied them, the pain began. The tools they used weren't new. They had names: the press, the screw, the Iron Maiden. These were instruments designed not to kill, but to open the body like a book and write lies across the soul. Bram held out. He begged, he wept, he denied it all. So they brought in Leora. They placed her in the chamber across from his. He was forced to listen as they worked on her first. The cries, the screams, the silence that followed. That's what finally broke him. He confessed not because it was true, but because in that moment, truth became meaningless. The only reality was ending her suffering. Said whatever they asked. Yes, they had murdered infants. Yes, they had crafted cursed candles. Yes, they had called upon the dark names in the forest at night. The interrogators smiled. They had their story. Next came Leora, broken, bleeding, but still coherent. She was shown a letter, Bram's confession, and told her husband had already admitted everything. Told she could save her children if she just confirmed it all. She did, and the children, they weren't spared. Even little Elric was made to remember the rituals his mother had taught him, the stories his father whispered in the dark. Lies fed to him became his truth. By the time the church scribes finished writing it all down, the Holloways had gone from waste workers to apocalyptic villains. Their confessions were signed in blood and tears. And yet, it wasn't enough. Lord Roderick had plans. Big ones. One family wasn't enough to justify the purge he wanted. He needed a conspiracy, a network, a secret cult infecting the nations. So the interrogators came back, and they whispered a single word to Bram through the prison bars. Names, one name. That's all it took. Bram lay on a slab of stone, his legs crushed from the rack, his fingers twisted from the press. His lips were split, his eyes nearly swollen shut. When they offered him a sip of water in exchange for a name, any name, he gave them one. Not an enemy, not someone guilty. Just someone who had once handed him bread in the street. The guard smiled, handed Bram a tin cup of water and waited, then asked for another name and another. Each sip bought a second of mercy. Second, without screaming. And Bram, drifting somewhere between pain and madness, gave them everything. Friends, neighbors, people who'd shown kindness, people who hadn't. Names became currency. Pain became law. Leora faced the same bargain. They told her Bram had already betrayed dozens, that it was too late to protect anyone, that the only way to save herself or her sons was to cooperate. She nodded. She spoke. Est! She offered names through bloody teeth and broken breath, and the scribes wrote each one down with care. Even the children were drawn into the spiral. Eller, just 9 years old, was told that his parents had confessed. They'd named him too, that if he didn't speak he would be burned alive. Broke. Of course he broke. Told them what they wanted. That he'd seen the rituals. That he'd helped stir the wax for the candles. That he'd watched them bury babies behind the house. Lies layered on top of pain. A child's memories rewritten by threats and fear. And once the names ran out, the interrogators began suggesting new ones. What about the woman with the twisted hand? Was she there? Yes, Bram whispered. And the miller's apprentice with the yellow eyes. Yes. By the end of it, over 300 names filled the records. Bakers, butchers, midwives, even clergy. Some were arrested immediately. Others fled, which only fueled the fire. The story the Holloways were forced to invent took on a monstrous life of its own. Under torture, the new prisoners told the same tales. Rituals in the forest, black candles, unholy chants. Every confession echoed the same nightmare, because the same hands wrote them. Lord Roderick now had what he needed. Proof of a vast conspiracy infecting the realm. He brought the case before the Holy Tribunal, paraded the scrolls of confessions like trophies. And as the flames of paranoia rose, so did his power. In Dorothan, bonfires burned late into the night. Arrests soared. Torture chambers filled. The Holloways had become the center of a storm they couldn't control. And yet, in the rare silences between pain, they remembered the grocer who had once given them bruised fruit, the old woman who watched Elric while Leora begged, the stable boy who gave Duran his first toy, all of them, now in chains. Their names had been traded like copper for water. The Holloways weren't just victims anymore. They had become weapons. Broken. Tools wielded by a machine of fear, forced to destroy those who once treated them as human. The dawn sky over Darathon was painted red firelight against mist. Crowds gathered in silence, as if the air itself dared not breathe. The execution grounds had been prepared for days, the route cleared by soldiers, the scaffolds raised like altars. This wasn't justice. It was a performance, and the Holloways were the stars. They were awakened before sunrise, scrubbed, dressed. In white, their chains polished to gleam. The white wasn't mercy. It was contrast for the blood, before the procession began. The guards allowed one final cruelty. They were brought together Bram, Leora, Yolan, Darren, and little Elrican. A stone chamber beneath the church. They weren't allowed to speak. Just to look. To understand. To say goodbye with their eyes. Then the march began. Bram, unable to walk, was dragged in a cart, his body barely intact. Leora was forced to walk behind, each clink of her chains a reminder of the hours left. Yolan and Darren walked beside her, heads down. Elric was carried. He was too small, too weak, too broken to stand, at every corner. The procession stopped. First hot irons were pressed into Bram's chest. The smell of burning flesh wafted over the crowd. Cheers rose. Children were hoisted onto shoulders. Priests shouted verses as the executioners continued their work tearing strips of skin. Breaking bones methodically, but not fatally. They needed him alive. They needed him to suffer. By the time they reached the scaffold, Bram was barely conscious. His body was tied to the wheel, spread open for all to see. There was no mercy blow, no final right. They left him there to die slowly under the morning sun, spectacle of rot and righteousness. Then came Laura. She was tied to the central post, her eyes fixed on Bram's broken frame. And just before the torch was lit, the final cruelty was delivered. The executioner tore her shirt open, in front of the crowd, in front of her sons. Her breasts, the symbols of her motherhood, were mutilated and forced against her children's mouths in a grotesque mockery of nurturing. The crowd, blood-hungry moments ago, fell silent. Even they hadn't expected this. Then came the flames. Leora. Holloway died screaming, not just from pain but from the unimaginable anguish of knowing her children were watching. Her final act was not of resistance, but of forced degradation. Designed to erase her humanity, Jale, and the eldest, was executed next. A clean beheading, but only after being forced to witness everything. Darren and Elric were kept alive for now. The crowd dispersed. Spectacle was over. But the Holloway line had not yet been erased. Elric, barely 9, was taken into custody by the Church of Cleansing Mercy. There, he was baptized again. Given a new name? Each day the priests told him his parents were devils. He must repent for their blood. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He simply stared, hollow and silent. 3 months later, the church decided his soul could not be saved. He was strangled, then burned. Darren met the same fate, though the records blur where and when. Perhaps because no one dared write down what really happened. By the end of winter, the Holloways were gone. Their name lived on, but not as truth, not as justice, as fear. The 300 names they had been forced to give became targets. Over the next year, dozens more executions followed. Entire families disappeared. Villages emptied. Anyone who had once been kind to the Holloways now lived in terror of their own shadow. And Lord Roderick was promoted, praised as the hand of purity, celebrated. For rooting out evil, his star rose on the ashes of the innocent. But this story isn't about witchcraft. It's about power. It's about how Azoli the voiceless become villains, how quickly a lie whispered through pain can birth a genocide. The Holloways were never monsters. They were poor, they were nameless, they were easy to destroy, and their story, like so many erased by time, reminds us of one brutal truth. When fear is law, innocence becomes the first crime.